Broken Bridge. John stood on the weather-beaten bridge, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon where the sun dipped below the hills. The river below flowed steadily, its gentle murmurs echoing the thoughts that churned in his mind. He was a man weighed down by regrets, haunted by the echoes of past mistakes that had shattered his family. Years had passed since Sarah, his daughter, had left home. Her departure had been a tumultuous storm of hurt and anger, leaving behind a fractured relationship that seemed irreparable. John's attempts to bridge the chasm between them had faltered, met with walls of silence and bitterness. In the quiet of his small cottage by the riverbank, John often found himself staring at old photographs, traces of a happier time when laughter echoed through the walls, and Sarah's smile lit up their home. Now those walls echoed with emptiness, the silence a constant reminder of his failure as a father. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in hues of crimson and gold, John found himself compelled to try once more. He picked up the phone, fingers trembling slightly as he dialed Sarah's number. Each ring felt like a heartbeat, a plea for a second chance. Finally, a hesitant voice answered on the other end. "Hello? Sarah?" John stammered, his voice betraying a mix of hope and apprehension. "It's me, your dad." There was a long pause, filled with the weight of unspoken words and unresolved pain. "What do you want, Dad?" Sarah's tone was guarded, her words laced with the years of hurt she had carried. I want to talk," John managed, his throat tight with emotion. "I want to see you, Sarah, please." Another silence followed, stretching between them like a fragile thread. Then, reluctantly, Sarah sighed. "Fine. Tomorrow, coffee shop on Main Street, noon." The line went dead, leaving John with a mix of relief and trepidation. Tomorrow held the promise of a chance to mend what had been broken, but also the uncertainty of facing the consequences of his mistakes. As darkness descended over the river, John sat by the window, watching the stars emerge one by one in the night sky. The weight of forgiveness hung heavy in the air, a burden he knew he must bear if he ever hoped to find redemption in his daughter's eyes. Seeking forgiveness. The morning of the meeting, John awoke early, the knot of anxiety in his stomach tightening with every passing minute. He stared at his reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror, a face weathered by time, guilt etched into the lines around his eyes. He had thought for years that simply waiting would heal the wounds he had caused, but waiting had only deepened the divide. Now he realized forgiveness wasn't something he could demand. It was something he had to earn. Before he could face Sarah, John knew he had to face himself and the others he'd hurt along the way. The first call he made was to his younger brother, Peter. Years ago, a petty argument over their late parents' estate had ended with angry words and a rift that neither had crossed since. The phone rang once, twice. John almost hung up, but then Peter answered. "John?" Peter's voice was cautious, heavy with old grudges. I just wanted to say I'm sorry," John said, the words tumbling out awkwardly, "for the way things ended between us. I was stubborn and selfish. I wasn't fair to you." There was a long pause. Then Peter sighed, the sound thick with years of tension slowly easing. "You hurt me, John. You made me feel like I didn't matter." "I know," John whispered, "and I'm sorry. I can't undo it, but I want to make things right if you'll let me." Peter didn't offer immediate forgiveness, but he didn't hang up either. For John, that was a beginning. Next, John drove to a quiet neighborhood where Mrs. Reynolds, an elderly woman he had once shouted at in a drunken rage, still lived. She opened the door slowly, her face wary. "I don't expect you to forgive me," John said, hat in hand, heart hammering against his ribs. "I was a different man back then, a worse man. But I'm trying to change. I needed you to know that." To his surprise, Mrs. Reynolds softened. "We all have our demons, John," she said quietly. "It's what you do after facing them that matters." Each apology was a battle, not against the people he'd wronged, but against the part of himself that wanted to turn away, to deny, to bury the shame deeper. Each time he confessed, the weight he carried grew heavier before it grew lighter, like pressing on a wound to draw out the poison. Some encounters ended in tentative hugs, others ended with doors gently closed in his face. John accepted both outcomes with the same humility. This was the price of the life he had led, the bridges he had burned. But the hardest apology, the most brutal confrontation, was with himself. Alone, sitting at the edge of the riverbank as twilight gathered once more, John pulled out an old notebook. In it, he wrote down every wrong he could remember: harsh words, selfish choices, moments when pride had been more important than love. Tears blurred the ink as he wrote. For the first time in his life, he allowed himself to truly grieve for the man he had been. By the time he finished, the stars had returned to the sky. John closed the notebook and pressed it to his chest, feeling the raw, aching emptiness where excuses had once lived. It was painful, humiliating, and strangely freeing. He was not yet whole. Maybe he never would be. But for the first time, John wasn't running from his past. He was walking through it, step by painful step. Tomorrow he would meet Sarah, and no matter what happened, he would face her with nothing hidden, nothing left unsaid. Um, it was the least and the most he could offer. Would you be the unlikely ally? The morning of his meeting with Sarah, John wandered into the small town square, his nerves rattling louder than the bells in the old chapel nearby. He wasn't ready. Every step toward that coffee shop felt heavier than the last. Doubts gnawed at him. What if she still hated him? What if no apology could ever be enough? Lost in these thoughts, John barely noticed the gentle voice calling after him. John Thatcher? He turned to see an elderly man sitting on a weathered bench under the shade of a sprawling oak. The man's skin was creased like a well-loved map, and his eyes shone with a calm that seemed immune to the chaos of the world. "You don't know me," the man said with a kind smile. "Name's Walter Hughes. I knew your father once. Good man. Stubborn as a mule, but good." John gave a small, tired laugh. "Sounds like it runs in the family." Walter patted the spot next to him. "Sit a minute. You look like a man carrying a heavy load." With a sigh, John sank onto the bench, the weight of his fears pulling his shoulders down. "You're on your way to see your daughter," Walter said, not as a question, but as a simple truth. "Word gets around in small towns." John nodded stiffly. "I don't know if it'll make a difference. I'm not sure I deserve another chance." Walter leaned back, his gaze following the dance of leaves overhead. "Deserve's got nothing to do with forgiveness," he said. "Forgiveness isn't earned like a paycheck. It's a gift. And sometimes the hardest person to forgive isn't someone else. It's yourself." John swallowed the lump rising in his throat. "I've made so many mistakes. Sometimes I wonder if it's even fair to ask for her forgiveness." Walter turned toward him, voice low and steady. "Son, asking for forgiveness isn't about taking from her. It's about giving her the choice, the freedom, to heal if she wants to. Maybe she's carried that anger long enough, too." John stared down at his calloused hands. "What if she can't?" "Then you love her anyway," Walter said simply. "You stand there, with your heart wide open, and you love her anyway. Healing doesn't always come the way we expect, but it always begins with honesty and hope." For a moment they sat in silence, the morning sun filtering through the branches above, the world holding its breath. Walter reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, smooth stone, pressing it into John's hand. "Carved this myself," he said. "See that crack down the middle? That's a reminder. Broken things can still be beautiful, sometimes even more beautiful, because they survived." John traced the uneven line running through the stone with his thumb, feeling a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough. Walter just smiled. "Go on now. She's waiting. And whatever happens, remember, today you chose courage. That matters." John stood, the stone clenched tightly in his hand, and nodded. As he turned toward the coffee shop at the end of the street, he felt the faintest easing of the burden on his back. Maybe the past couldn't be erased. Maybe forgiveness was a mountain he would climb for the rest of his life. But for the first time, John believed the summit might just be within reach. Reconciliation. John stood outside the coffee shop, his heart thudding heavily against his ribs. The small stone Walter had given him rested in his pocket, its weight a steady reminder of the conversation they'd shared. For a long moment, he stared at the door, the reflection of his worn face staring back at him through the glass. He took a deep breath, pushed the door open, and stepped inside. The place was nearly empty except for a few early patrons. And there, by the window, sat Sarah. She was stirring her coffee absently, her shoulders tight, her expression guarded. Her hair was shorter than he remembered, and there was a sadness in her eyes that twisted the knife of regret deeper into John's gut. He approached slowly, almost afraid she might vanish if he moved too fast. "Hi, Sarah," he said, voice low, uncertain. She looked up, her lips pressed into a thin line. Hi. John slid into the seat across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick, but it was no longer empty. It was heavy, full of everything they needed to say. I almost didn't come, Sarah said finally, her fingers tightening around her cup. I wouldn't have blamed you if you hadn't, John said, honestly. But I'm grateful you did. Sarah glanced out the window, blinking against the light. What do you want from me, Dad? John shook his head. Nothing. I'm not here to ask anything from you. Zelite, I'm here because I needed to tell you I was wrong about so much, about the way I treated you, about the things I prioritized over you. I see it now, how much I hurt you. And I'm so sorry, Sarah. I can't expect you to forgive me. I can't erase the years I've stolen from us, but I needed you to know that I've changed. I'm trying to be better, even if it's too late. Sarah's jaw tightened, her eyes shimmering. You weren't there when I needed you most. You chose your anger, your pride, your drinking over me, again and again. I know, John said, voice breaking. I see it now in ways I couldn't or wouldn't back then, and every day I regret it, not because I want to ease my own guilt, but because you deserved so much better. He pulled the small stone from his pocket and placed it gently on the table between them. A man told me something today, he said quietly. He said broken things can still be beautiful if they survive. I don't know if we can survive this, Sarah, but I'm willing to try for as long as it takes, even if it means I sit across from you for years before you can look at me without hurt in your eyes, even if you never forgive me. Sarah stared at the stone, her fingers hovering over it but not touching. For a long time she said nothing. Then, her voice barely above a whisper, she said, Do you even know how many nights I cried myself to sleep? How many birthdays I waited by the door, hoping you'd show up? John bowed his head, tears slipping freely down his cheeks. I'm so sorry, baby girl. I can never give you those years back, but if you'll let me, I want to be here now. I want to be better now. Sarah finally touched the stone, tracing the crack with her fingertip just as John had. She let out a shaky breath. I don't know if I can forgive you today, she said, her voice raw. But maybe we can start with today. John looked up at her, his vision blurred with tears, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, he saw something shift in her eyes. Not trust, not yet, but something like the faintest flicker of hope. I would like that, he whispered. Sarah nodded, and very slowly she extended her hand across the table. John took it, his rough hand trembling as it closed around hers. The bridge between them wasn't rebuilt in that moment. But for the first time, a single, fragile plank was laid across the chasm, and it was enough to take the first step. The weight of forgiveness. The days that followed were cautious, delicate. John and Sarah met for coffee again the next week, this time without the pressure of saying everything all at once. They spoke of small things, work, the changing seasons, memories of the town, circling around the deeper wounds like two dancers afraid to step on old broken ground. Sarah often caught herself studying him, looking for cracks in this new version of her father. Sometimes she found them, moments when old habits flickered in his eyes, a sudden flash of guilt or self-loathing that he tried to hide. And every time she felt the battle within herself, the part that wanted to believe he had changed and the part that clung to her anger like armor. Some nights, Sarah lay awake, staring at the ceiling, memories flooding her. The nights he never came home, the shouting matches that rattled the walls, the lonely ache of birthdays and recitals he missed. Those scars were real. They would not vanish simply because he said he was sorry. But there was something else too, a new memory, small and fragile. The way John's hand shook when he held the stone out to her, the way his voice cracked when he said her name. His brokenness mirrored her own. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't asking to erase the past. He was asking to carry it together. One afternoon, as they sat on a park bench watching the river roll by, Sarah finally spoke the words that had been clawing at her throat. I'm scared, she admitted. Scared that if I let you back into my life, you'll hurt me again. John didn't rush to reassure her. He didn't offer empty promises. He simply nodded, his eyes full of understanding. I'm scared too, he said softly. Scared I'll fail you, but I want to spend whatever time I have left proving that I won't. The honesty of it cracked something open in Sarah. Not a flood of forgiveness, Not a clean slate, but something quieter, deeper, acceptance. Forgiveness, she realized, wasn't a single moment. It wasn't one tearful hug or one conversation that wiped everything away. Forgiveness was a decision she would have to make over and over, like breathing, a willingness to loosen her grip on the past, little by little. And in doing so, she wasn't just freeing John from his shame. She was freeing herself from the chains of anger and sorrow that had weighed her down for so long. She reached into her bag and pulled out the small, cracked stone he had given her. She kept it now as a reminder. Broken things could still be beautiful. They could still be strong. Sarah looked at her father, really looked at him, and saw not the monster of her childhood fears, but a man trying, faltering, but trying. She smiled, a small, tentative smile, and John's face crumpled in quiet, overwhelmed gratitude. They sat there for a long while, saying little, letting the river carry away the words they no longer needed. Forgiveness was not forgetting. It was not excusing. It was choosing to move forward, together, bearing the weight of the past, not as a burden, but as proof of the distance they had traveled. And somehow, that made all the difference.